You know, the story of Jonah, we all think we know it, right? A reluctant prophet, a giant fish, a city that suddenly turns from its ways. But what if the simple story we learned as kids misses the entire point? Let's dive in, because the real story is so much darker, deeper, and way more challenging than you might think.
We pretty much boil it down to this, don't we? Jonah runs from God, gets swallowed by a fish as a sort of timeout, he learns his lesson, and then he obeys. It's this nice, neat little tale about doing what you're told. But honestly, that children's story version completely flattens a book that is wrestling with some of the biggest, messiest questions of all.
The real story is actually this raw, unflinching look at the tension between God's incredible mercy and our own very human demand for justice. And it's a story that hinges not just on a fish, but on something way bigger, death and resurrection. So let's pull back the curtain and see what's really going on in the book of Jonah.
Okay, so first things first, we've got to address a major debate right out of the gate. A lot of scholars today will dismiss this book as, a parable, maybe a fairy tale. But to really get its message, we need to see why the text itself presents Jonah not as some fictional character, but as a real person in history.
I mean, the evidence really starts to stack up fast. The writing style, it doesn't read like a parable, it reads just like the historical books of Kings, naming real people and real places. And crucially, Jonah is mentioned as a real prophet in the book of 2 Kings. But here's the big one. Jesus himself treats Jonah as a real historical figure, even staking his own resurrection on what he calls the sign of Jonah. Think about that. If Jonah is just fiction, then Jesus is anchoring his most important truth in a myth.
Now, to really grasp why Jonah was so reluctant, we have to understand his world. This isn't just about one guy's personal hang-ups. This is about being sent straight into the heart of a terrifying, unbelievably brutal empire.
You see, Jonah wasn't some sheltered country boy. He was from Galilee, which was basically an international crossroads, just teeming with foreigners, traders, soldiers from all over the known world. He would have been cosmopolitan, not narrow-minded at all. And this right here creates the central puzzle. Why would a man so familiar with other nations be so incredibly resistant to going to one?
Woe to the bloody city! That's how another prophet, Nahum, described Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire. And that's not just poetic exaggeration, that's a moral verdict. This was the place God told Jonah to go.
See, the Assyrian Empire wasn't just powerful, it was terrifying by design. For more than 700 years, it was this grinding, dominant force in the ancient world. It even conquered mighty Egypt. Their entire power structure was built on a very specific foundation: pure fear. And their brutality, it wasn't just a byproduct of war, it was a calculated state policy. Assyria used deliberate, public terror to break resistance before it could even start. Stories of their cruelty traveled way ahead of their armies. This was the existential threat Jonah was being sent to go warn.
Now, let's look at the timeline, because this is absolutely key to Jonah's whole struggle. Jonah preaches, and Nineveh gets spared around 770 BC. But about 150 years later, the prophet Nahum declares their time is finally up, and the empire is totally destroyed. Jonah never saw that final justice. He only saw the monster get a second chance. And it's this huge gap between mercy and judgment. That's the source of his entire crisis.
Okay, now we get to the most famous part of the story, the great fish. But what if the way we've always pictured it, as some kind of submarine survival pod, is completely and totally wrong?
Let's ask the question the text really wants us to ask: what actually happened after Jonah was thrown overboard? The answer isn't in cartoons or children's books. It's in the specific, haunting language that Jonah himself uses.
Jonah doesn't describe floating or even struggling. He describes sinking. The roots of the mountains. My head was wrapped in seaweed. This is the language of the seabed. This is the language of a body that has drowned and settled on the ocean floor.
And right here, this is the most powerful clue. Jonah says he cried out from the belly of Sheol. He talks about the bars of the pit closing on him forever. This is not the language of a close call. This is the language of death, of finality.
And just to be crystal clear, Sheol wasn't some poetic term for a dangerous situation. In Hebrew thought, it was the literal realm of the dead, the actual place of departed spirits. Jonah is telling us exactly where he was. He believed he was dead.
So you really have two ways to read this. The common view is survival, the fish as a sort of lifeboat. But the text itself points to resurrection,
with the fish as a means of recovering his body. It's not a story about endurance. It's a story about death and restoration. And this makes perfect sense of Jesus' words when he compares Jonah's fate to his own. He's talking about burial and rising, not just a close call.
Okay, so now that we see the true scale of the miracle, we can finally tackle the book's central question. Why did Jonah run in the first place? And the answer is not fear. It's not prejudice. It's theological. And it's deeply, deeply personal.
You know, people get so fixated on the fish, but that's really a mistake. The book of Jonah isn't about one miracle. It's a whole cascade of them. God commands the wind, the sea, a fish, a plant, a worm, and the weather. The book is making a massive point about God's absolute sovereignty over every single part of creation.
But within this whole cascade of divine power, the most revealing miracle isn't the most spectacular one. It's not the fish.
It's the worm. Yeah, the worm. Think about it. You can train intelligent animals, sure, but nobody trains a worm. The text just quietly shows us a God who governs the smallest, most insignificant creature just as easily as the mightiest storm. The message is crystal clear. Nature isn't just happening, nature is responding to God.
So why run from a God who is this powerful? Jonah tells us himself, and it is absolutely stunning. He didn't run because he was afraid of the Assyrians. He ran because he was afraid of God's mercy. He actually says, "I knew you would do this." He knew God would forgive them, and he just couldn't stand it. You see, Jonah's problem wasn't simple hatred. It was a crisis of timing and of justice. He genuinely believed mercy was wasted on truly wicked people. He figured that sparing Assyria, this bloody city, would only postpone the inevitable judgment, and in the meantime, it would endanger his own people, Israel. He wasn't just being selfish, he was jealous for what he saw as God's justice. And that brings us to the book's very strange, abrupt, and honestly powerful ending. There is no neat resolution. Instead, the story pivots, and it turns the final question back on Jonah and on us.
Jonah is furious that a plant that gave him shade has died, and God just so gently exposes his heart with this final question. You cared this much for a temporary plant. Should I not care about a whole city full of people, even if they are my enemies? And the book ends. Right there, Jonah is silent, because the question isn't for him anymore. It's for us.